The men who went into that bayou numbered 11. Only 4 of us walked back out. I've told this story exactly twice in my life. Once to a Catholic priest in the winter of 1931, and once to a government man who came to my door in 1944, asking questions I could tell he did not truly want answered. Both times I was careful about what I said. Both times I left the most important parts out. I am 81 years old now, and I do not expect to see another spring. So I'm going to tell it properly, the way it actually happened, without softening any of the edges or explaining away the parts that cannot be explained. If you think I am a foolish old man whose memory has curdled over the decades, that is your right. But I was 23 years old in October of 1913, and my mind was sharp as a skinning knife, and I saw what I saw, and I have not slept a full night since. My name is Augustin Delacroix Fonteneux. I was born in 1890 in the parish of St. Landry, in the part of Louisiana that most people outside the state have never heard of and have no reason to seek out. My father was a trapper and a sometimes hunter, a lean, quiet man who smelled of cypress water and tobacco, and who taught me before I could read that the swamp was not a place to be taken lightly. He had a saying in Creole French that I will translate roughly as this: "The bayou does not belong to the living." He meant it as a caution about the physical dangers of the water, the snakes and the gators, and the shifting ground that could swallow a man whole if he stepped wrong. At least, that is how I understood it when I was a boy. After October of 1913, I understood it differently. The hunting party was organized by a man named Clifford Arsenault. Clifford was 38 that year, a wealthy man by the standards of the parish, the kind of man who had 2 good horses and a motor car that mostly worked, and a large white house with a gallery that wrapped around 3 sides. He was not a cruel man, but he was a commanding one, the sort of man who decided things and expected those decisions to be carried out without a great deal of discussion. He had been organizing these autumn hunts for several years before the one I am describing. They were a tradition among the more prosperous men of the surrounding area, a week or 10 days in the deep swamp chasing white-tailed deer and feral hog and whatever else presented itself. The hunting was secondary, honestly. The main business was the fellowship, the cooking over fire, the whiskey passed around after dark, the particular pleasure of being men together in a place without roofs or schedules. Clifford had invited me along for the first time that year. I was not wealthy, not by any measure, but I had a reputation as a capable woodsman and a decent shot, and I believe he thought I would be useful to the party in practical ways, dressing game and reading water and that sort of thing. I was flattered by the invitation. I should not have accepted it. The other men in the party were a particular attorney from Opelousas named Gerald Trosclair, a man of perhaps 50 with a white mustache who had more money than sense and more confidence than either. With him came his nephew, a young man of about 25 named Emile, a man who was quiet and obedient and clearly did not want to be there, but had not found the courage to say so. There was a pair of brothers named Savoy, Claude and Remy, both in their mid-30s, who were genuine hunters in the serious old tradition and who spoke little but observed everything. There were 2 men from further away, from the direction of Baton Rouge, whose names I never fully learned. I knew one as Broussard and the other as the Fat One, which sounds unkind, but was simply how everyone referred to him, including himself. There was a man called Tante's Boy, whose actual name was Séverin Doucet, a cousin of Clifford's wife, who was 17 and had no business being on an expedition like that one. And there were 2 hired men, guides and porters, Creole men named Placide and Anselme, who knew the deep bayou better than any of us, and who, I realize now, tried several times during the course of that week to warn us in ways we were too proud or too ignorant to understand. We departed on a Monday morning in mid-October, when the heat of the Louisiana summer had finally broken and the air had taken on that particular cool sweetness that makes the swamp almost beautiful. We traveled by flat-bottomed boat, 4 boats total, loaded with supplies for 10 days. Salt pork, dried beans, flour, coffee, rice, cane syrup, and considerable quantities of whiskey and canned goods. We had tent canvas and rope and cooking equipment and, of course, enough firearms to have supplied a small militia. I had my father's Winchester rifle and a .30 caliber lever action that I had cleaned and oiled the night before, and that I carried as if it were a family member, which in a sense it was. The journey into the interior took most of that first day. I had been into the bayou many times, but never this far south and west, into the section of swamp that the locals called the Fonds Noirs, which translated roughly as the black bottoms or the dark depths, depending on who you asked. The name was not poetic. It referred to the actual color of the water in that region, which was so dark with tannins from rotting cypress wood that it appeared almost black even in full sunlight, and which absorbed rather than reflected the sky above it. The cypress trees grew enormous here, their bases flaring out into wide knees that stood above the waterline like the legs of giants frozen mid-stride. A Spanish moss hung in curtains so thick that it reduced visibility to a matter of yards in any direction. The birds here were different too. Fewer songbirds, more of the heavy silent types, herons and anhingas and the occasional woodstock standing motionless on a cypress knee like something carved rather than alive. Placide and Anselm navigated without maps, by memory and by reading the water and the vegetation. I watched them work and respected what I saw. These were men who carried the geography of this place in their bodies. At one point during the afternoon, as we passed between 2 stands of particularly ancient cypress, I noticed Anselm make a small gesture with his left hand, quick and almost invisible, touching 2 fingers to his chest briefly before returning his hand to the oar. I had seen old Creole people do similar things before, small private acknowledgments toward something unseen. I said nothing. The other men in the boat had not noticed. We made camp on a piece of relatively solid ground, a natural levee perhaps 30 yards wide and 100 yards long, that rose maybe 3 feet above the surrounding water. Clifford had used this site before, on previous expeditions, and there was evidence of old camps there. A ring of stones for a fire, some rotted canvas from a previous tent, the rusted remains of a coffee tin half buried in the mud. The ground was covered in a thick layer of fallen cypress needles that muffled sound underfoot and smelled of damp earth and something else. Something I could not name then, a dark organic sweetness underneath the familiar swamp smell, like old blood mixed with the deep mud. I noticed it when we landed. I mentioned it to no one. The first 2 days were everything a hunting party is supposed to be. The weather held clear and cool. Game was present in good numbers. Claude Savoy took a large buck on the morning of the second day, an 8-point animal in good condition, and the butchering and salting of the meat occupied most of the afternoon and put everyone in high spirits. We ate well that evening. The fire was large and the whiskey flowed, and Trosclair the attorney told a long, ridiculous story about a court case that had everyone laughing, including the hired men. The night sounds were normal. Frogs in the thousands, owls, the occasional distant grunt of an alligator. I slept well both nights. I have thought about that since. I wondered whether the thing that was out there was watching us those first days and simply had not decided what to do with us yet. The change began on the 3rd day, subtly enough that I almost did not register it. We had split into smaller groups that morning to cover more ground, which was standard practice on these expeditions. I went out with Remy Savoy and Placide, pushing south and west into denser territory, wading through water that reached our thighs in places, and climbing over the arching roots of old cypress trees. We were gone most of the morning and into the early afternoon. I shot a young feral hog at around 11 o'clock, a clean shot through the neck, and we spent time gutting and quartering it before heading back. It was on the return journey that Remy stopped walking. He stopped without saying anything. and just went still the way a good hunter goes still, total and immediate cessation of movement. I stopped behind him. Placide, bringing up the rear, stopped also. We stood like that for perhaps 30 seconds. I could not see anything. The swamp around us was as it always was, hanging moss, dark water, the occasional ripple from something below the surface. Then Remy slowly turned his head to look at Placide, a questioning look. Placide's face had changed. He was looking at the tree line to the west of us with an expression I had not seen on him before, an expression that did not belong on a man who had spent his entire life in these swamps. It was fear. Not the practical, alert fear of a man who hears a rattlesnake. Something older, something personal. Remy said quietly, in French, "What is it?" Placide did not answer right away. Then he said, and in a low voice, the birds stopped. I had not noticed, but once he said it, I understood that he was right. The constant background noise of the swamp, which we had all been hearing for days without consciously registering it, had simply stopped. No frogs yet, it was still daytime, but the birds should have been calling. They were not. The silence had a texture to it, a density, as though the air itself had changed composition. We waited another minute. Nothing moved. Then, from somewhere to the west, far off but unmistakably real, came a sound that I am going to struggle to describe adequately. It was low, very low, lower than you would expect any living throat to produce, a resonance more than a pitch, the kind of sound that you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. It lasted perhaps 4 or 5 seconds and then stopped. It was not the howl of a wolf. I knew wolves, had heard them. It was not the cry of any large cat. It was something between a moan and a growl, with a quality of deliberateness to it, as though the creature making it was doing so intentionally, for a purpose, rather than as a reflexive animal sound. Placide said one word in a flat, quiet voice. He said Rougarou. Then he turned and walked back toward camp at a pace that was not quite a run, but was faster than we had been moving all morning. I looked at Remy. He was an experienced man, unflappable, the kind of hunter who had tracked bear without companions and thought nothing of it. He was looking in the direction the sound had come from with a stillness that was different from his usual hunting stillness. After a moment he turned and followed Placide without speaking. I followed them both. Back at camp I found that the others had heard something too. Broussard and the fat man, Severin, and 2 others who had gone out in a different direction had returned early also. Severin, who was 17 and who had been treating the whole expedition as a grand adventure, was sitting on a log near the fire ring looking pale and smaller than usual. He said they had heard it from the northeast, so it had not been moving away from us. It had been positioned somewhere between the 2 groups when it made that sound. Clifford Arsenault dismissed it. He was that kind of man. He had an explanation for everything, a reassuring masculine certainty about the natural world that I had found admirable before that day and found infuriating after it. He said it was an alligator. That large old bulls could make extraordinary sounds during territorial disputes. He said the quiet of the birds was because of a hawk we had failed to notice. He said Placide and Anselm were superstitious old men, and that we should not let their backward beliefs infect the spirit of the party. He poured himself a whiskey and declared that dinner would be good, and that tomorrow's hunting would be better. Placide was not present for this speech. I realized I had not seen him since we returned to camp. I found him eventually at the edge of the levee where we had beached the boats, sitting on a cypress root and looking out over the water with his elbows on his knees. Anselm was with him. They were speaking in low, Creole French, the fast, dense dialect of the deep parishes that I could follow in fragments, but not completely. And I heard Placide say a phrase I knew, a phrase from the old stories I had grown up with, something that translated approximately as "it has smelled us." Anselm said something back. Then he looked up and saw me standing there. There was a moment between us. Anselm was a man of about 50, lean and dark-skinned, with hands that looked like they had been doing hard physical work since birth, and eyes that had seen a great deal and judged very little. He looked at me the way you look at someone when you are deciding whether or not they can be talked to. Then he said to me, in English, which he spoke carefully and well, "We are going to recommend to the party that we leave in the morning." He paused. "Clifford will refuse. He said it as a fact. I would like you to try to persuade him. I'm telling you this because you know how to be in the swamp and because you are young enough that maybe you still listen." I asked him what he thought it was. He and Placide exchanged a look. Then Anselm said, "You have heard the stories." I said I had. He said, "The stories are not stories." He stood up from the cypress root and walked back toward camp. I want to be precise about what I believed at that moment, standing at the edge of the water in the dying October light, because what a man believes is important, and because I have been asked about this point specifically in the years since. I was 23. I had been educated by the church and by a practical father who respected the swamp without superstition. I did not believe in the Rougarou as a literal creature. I believed in the tradition of the Rougarou, of the old French Creole werewolf legend that had traveled over from France and Quebec and mutated in Louisiana's specific dark soil into something particular to this place. I believed it was a story used to explain behavior and control social boundaries in isolated communities, a cultural mechanism, as I might have said if I had been a more educated young man. I did not believe there was a large wolf creature walking upright through the cypress trees. I believed something unusual had made an unusual sound, and that Placide and Anselm, good men and experienced woodsmen, had been frightened by it in a way that connected to their cultural inheritance. That was what I believed. I did try to persuade Clifford. He laughed at me in a kind way, and he called me a good boy and told me to have a drink and not let the guide's superstitions crawl under my skin. Gerald Trosclair made a more elaborate speech about the ignorance of the uneducated rural poor and their tendency to mythologize natural phenomena. I ate my supper. I cleaned my rifle. I went to my bedroll and lay on my back in the tent listening to the swamp come alive at night around me. The night sounds on the third night were different. Not absent this time, not like the silence we had experienced in the afternoon. Louder, in fact. The frogs were in full voice and the night birds were calling, but there was something underneath it all, something that kept pulling my attention sideways, like a word spoken just below the threshold of hearing. I lay still for a long time. Eventually, I slept, but lightly, of the kind of sleep where some part of the mind keeps watch. I woke at what I estimate was around 2 in the morning. The camp was quiet. Through the canvas of the tent, I could see the remnant glow of the fire, mostly embers now, and I could hear something at the edge of the water. It was a sound of displacement, the specific liquid sound of something large moving through shallow water at the edge of the levee. Not thrashing, not the burst and crash of an alligator. Slow, deliberate, measured. Step and pause. Step and pause. Whatever it was moving slowly, with intention. I lay completely still. The sound continued for perhaps 2 minutes, moving along the eastern edge of the levee and then stopped. The silence after it stopped was absolute. I did not sleep again that night. In the morning, I said nothing about what I had heard, partly because I could not prove anything and partly because I was already feeling the particular frustration of a man whose concerns have been dismissed once and who does not want to be laughed at again. But I watched Placide when I poured my coffee, and I could see from the way he was looking at the eastern waterline that he had heard it too. We did not speak about it. The 4th day was when things began to change in ways that could not be dismissed. Claude Savoy found the tracks. He had gone out alone that morning, early, before full light, as was his habit. He came back to camp at around 7 o'clock and said to his brother, in a voice carefully calibrated to sound casual, "Come here a minute." Remy followed him. I was close enough to watch, and something in Claude's tone made me follow at a distance. Well, he led us to the northeastern end of the levee, where the solid ground gave way to a narrow mud flat before the tree line, an area of soft gray-brown mud perhaps 15 yards wide between the camp and the first stand of cypress. The tracks were there, clearly visible in the mud, numerous, overlapping as though whatever had made them had paced back and forth in that area for some time. What I'm about to describe I have thought about and rethought about for 60 years, and I have not found any explanation that satisfies me. The tracks were large, larger than any human foot, wider, the individual impressions perhaps 14 inches from heel to toe. They showed 5 toes, which eliminated the major local predators that might otherwise have explained them. Bear and panther both have different configurations. But the more disturbing element was not the size. It was the inconsistency. Looking at the tracks in sequence, you could see a pattern of transformation. At the far eastern edge of the mud flat, where the tracks emerged from the direction of the water, they were wider, more splayed, the toe impressions deep and individually distinct in a way that suggested an animal walking on its full foot, what a naturalist would call a plantigrade gait. Moving west toward the camp, they changed. The stride lengthened. The heel impressions became shallower, while the ball and toe impressions deepened. By the time the tracks reached the midpoint of the mud flat, they were beginning to look less like an animal track and more like a human track, if a human foot were that size. Narrower in the midfoot, the heel striking clearly. By the westernmost edge of the mud flat, closest to our camp, the track pattern was bipedal without question. 2-legged, upright, and then they stopped, 50 feet from our camp perimeter. They simply ended in the mud, as though the creature had ceased to exist at that point, or had leapt such a distance that the next impact fell outside the mud flat, onto the firmer ground of the levee itself. But we found no impression on the levee ground to match, and the cypress needle cover there was not disturbed in any pattern consistent with a landing from a significant jump. Remy Savoy knelt in the mud for a long time studying these tracks without speaking. He was the more experienced tracker of the 2 brothers, though both were excellent. He was a methodical man, not given to drama. When he finally stood up, he did not say Rougarou, and he did not say anything supernatural. What he said was, "I have never seen anything like this in 40 years of hunting." He said it quietly, to his brother, and the quietness of it was more disturbing than any dramatic declaration would have been. Claude looked at the westernmost tracks, the bipedal ones, and then looked at our camp, measuring the distance. He said, "It stood here and watched us." We brought Clifford to see the tracks. Clifford looked at them for a long time. I watched his face go through several stages. He started with the confident dismissiveness of the previous day, hands on his hips, a slight smile. The smile went first. Then the confidence went. He ended up crouched in the mud studying the transitional section of the tracks, where the gait shifted from animal to upright, and his face by then was simply blank, to the expression of a man whose mental frameworks are being quietly dismantled. He said it was a bear. He said it with less force than he usually said things. Remy Savoy, who had crouched next to him, said, "I've been tracking bear since I was a boy. This is not a bear track. The toe configuration is entirely wrong. A bear's outer toes are wider set. These are closer together, more like a primate." He paused, "More like a man." Clifford stood up and told everyone to break for breakfast and that we would evaluate conditions after eating. This was the closest he came to acknowledging that something required evaluating. After breakfast, Anselm asked to speak to the group. Clifford gave him permission with a wave of his hand, with the gracious condescension of a man granting an indulgence. Anselm stood near the fire ring and looked at each of us in turn before he spoke. He said, "The Rougarou is a real thing. I am telling you this not as a story. I'm telling you as a man who has lived in this swamp for 50 years. There are territories in these bayous that do not belong to human hunters. We are in one of those territories. The creature knows we are here. It spent last night walking the edge of this camp. It has shown you its tracks so that you understand what you are dealing with. This is a warning. My strong advice is that we leave today." Trosclair the attorney began to speak. Anselm looked at him, and Trosclair stopped speaking, which surprised everyone, including Trosclair. Anselm continued. "I'm not going to argue about whether you believe me. You have seen the tracks. You have heard it. Make your own judgment. But Placide and I will be taking one of the boats and leaving this afternoon regardless of what the party decides. You are welcome to come with us." Clifford said he was not going to be run off by a footprint in the mud. He said it with something close to his old authority, but not quite. It was an echo of his usual certainty rather than the thing itself. 4 men chose to leave with Placide and Anselm that afternoon. Émile Trosclair, young and frightened and sensible enough not to care how it looked, the fat man Broussard, whose name I have since forgotten entirely, and 2 others whose names I am also uncertain of now, the passage of years being what it is. They loaded into one of the flat-bottomed boats and pushed off north. Placide looked at me once before they left. His expression said something I understood as, "You could still come," and I thought about my father's rifle. I thought about the fact that I did not fully believe what I was dealing with. I stayed. 7 of us remained. Clifford, myself, Gerald Trosclair the elder, the Savoy brothers, Séverin Doucet, and a man named Etienne, whose last name I have genuinely lost to time, a stout, quiet man from somewhere near Crotts Springs, who had mostly kept to himself throughout the trip. The 4th night was when the real nature of what we were dealing with began to become undeniable. We organized a watch rotation that evening, which was Clifford's compromise with the anxiety of the group. 2 men awake at all times, stationed at opposite ends of the levee, with instructions to fire their rifles in the air as a signal if anything was seen or heard. We kept the fire burning higher than usual. As we brought all the food supplies into the center of the camp and covered them with canvas weighted at the edges. We were being sensible and practical and military about it, which is the masculine instinct when faced with something terrifying. Establish a perimeter and a protocol and pretend that this makes you safe. I had the watch from 10 o'clock to midnight with Claude Savoy. We sat at our positions, Claude at the northern end of the levee and myself at the southern, and watched the dark and listened. The fire behind me was warm on my back. The swamp was doing what it always did at night, the frogs calling, the occasional splash, the bark of a barred owl somewhere in the canopy above. I sat with my rifle across my knees and tried to believe that this was a normal night watch. At approximately 11:15, the frogs stopped. Not gradually. Not as they sometimes go quiet when a large predator moves nearby, in a rippling wave of silence that spreads outward from the disturbance. All at once. Every frog within earshot fell silent simultaneously, as though they had received a signal. The owls stopped too. The crickets stopped. The swamp, which had been speaking in its 1,000 voices a moment before, went absolutely quiet. I heard my own heartbeat. Then, from the water to the south, I heard the sound I'd heard on the previous night from inside my tent, but closer now. Much closer. The slow, measured displacement of something large moving through shallow water. But this time, there was something additional. Between the sounds of movement in the silences, I could hear breathing, deep, rhythmic, controlled breathing, not the panting of an excited animal, and not the shallow, quick breath of something nervous. The controlled, even breath of something that was calm, that was not running, that was not excited. That was simply there, and moving, and in no apparent hurry. I said nothing. I did not fire my rifle in the air, which I should have done by the protocol we had established. I sat completely still because some deep and ancient part of my nervous system had decided that stillness was the correct response, that movement or sound from my direction would change something that was not yet decided. I cannot fully explain this instinct. It was not a rational decision. It was older than rational decision. The sound moved along the southern edge of the levee from east to west, perhaps 20 yards out in the water, and then it stopped. The breathing continued, and then, by some quality I still cannot name scientifically, I became aware that whatever was out there had stopped because it had detected me, that it knew I was sitting at the edge of the levee, and that it was considering what to do with this information. We sat there, the creature and I, in the darkness and the silence, for what my later recollection estimates at 4 or 5 minutes, though it may have been less. Time does strange things under that kind of pressure. Then the breathing changed. A single, deep inhalation, very long, the kind of breath a creature takes when it is drawing in scent, processing information, making a decision. And then the sound of movement again, but different now. Moving north. Moving along the western edge of the levee, toward the camp. I stood up. My legs were not entirely steady. I said loudly, "Claude?" There was a pause. Claude said, "From the far end of the levee, I hear it. I heard the rest of the camp come awake." Voices. The clatter of someone picking up a firearm. A light appeared, a kerosene lantern held by Clifford Arsenault, who had emerged from his tent with remarkable speed for a man his age. He stood holding the lantern at the edge of the camp and peering into the darkness toward the water. The creature did not respond to the light or the noise. It continued moving north along the waterline, its speed unchanged, deliberate and unhurried. In the light of Clifford's lantern, I watched the surface of the water to the northwest of the camp, perhaps 35 yards out, and I saw, briefly, a shape. I need to be precise about what I saw, because this is the part of the account where I know I will be doubted most severely. I saw a disturbance in the water's surface, a V-shaped wake, the kind a large body makes when it moves through water at the surface rather than swimming below it. And above the water, in the edge of the lantern light, I saw something that was the height of a large man or larger, that was moving upright, that was dark in color, and that turned its head as it passed through the edge of the light. I saw the reflection of the lantern light in its eyes. 2 points of amber light, perhaps 5.5 feet above the waterline, too high and too widely spaced for any alligator, too far from the ground for a large dog or cat. They did not glow from within the way the eyes of some animals appear to glow in photographs. They simply reflected light the way any eye reflects light, but from a height and from a configuration that told me unequivocally that I was looking at a creature that was standing upright in that water. The eyes were looking at us. For perhaps 2 seconds they were visible. Then the creature turned its head away, and the reflection vanished, and the shape in the water continued north and then turned east and moved away from the levee, and the sound of its movement decreased and eventually faded into the swamp sounds that had begun to resume. Tentatively at first, then more fully, the frogs returning, the crickets, the owls, as though the surrounding swamp had collectively decided that the danger had passed. No one spoke for a long time after that. We stood around the lantern, all 7 of us now, having all emerged from tents or from our watch positions, and we looked at each other in that orange light. Clifford's face had finally and completely abandoned its previous composure. He did not look frightened exactly. He looked like a man who has been wrong about something important and is now doing the work of adjusting. He looked older than he had looked that morning. Gerald Trosclair said quietly, "I saw its eyes." He said it to no one in particular, to the air. Nobody disputed this. We did not sleep for the remainder of that night. We sat around the fire, which we built higher, and we talked in the way that people talk when they are frightened and too proud to say they are. Frightened, circling around the central fact without quite landing on it. Clifford proposed various theories. He talked about large primates. It was about the possibility that something undiscovered could be living in the deep bayou, which was true enough that it was technically not a concession to the supernatural. Remy Savoy listened to all of this with his usual patience and eventually said, "Clifford, I have respect for you as a man, but I am going to ask you to be honest with yourself about what we just saw." Clifford was quiet for a while after that. I sat apart from the main group near the end of the night and thought about what Anselm had said. It has smelled us. It had. It had been aware of us, had been watching and assessing us, since at least the third day. And now it had come to the edge of the camp. Not into the camp. To the edge. Deliberately. It had stood in the water 35 yards from our fire and looked at us and then turned and walked away. This was not the behavior of a simple predator, of a hungry animal that had scented prey. This was the behavior of something that was making a point. Something that was telling us it knew we were here, that it had been watching, and that it had chosen thus far to do nothing, and that this choosing was itself a form of communication. I thought about what Placide had said. It has smelled us. And I thought about how we had been making noise and fire and cooking meat for 4 days, and how the creature had made its first sound on the third day, as though it had spent 2 days deciding what to make of us before announcing its awareness of our presence. And I thought about the tracks in the mud, the transformation from animal gait to upright stride, the deliberate placement of those tracks where we would find them in the morning. And it wanted us to know what it was. I'm not sure why that thought was more frightening than anything else, but it was. The 5th day dawned grey and damp, a low overcast sky pressing down on the canopy and reducing the light to a flat, dim quality that made everything look older than it was. Nobody proposed going out to hunt. The conversation at breakfast was about leaving, which had become the real subject, the thing everyone was thinking about and which only needed someone to say it plainly. Clifford was the obstacle, not because he still had objections, but because he was the kind of man who needed to make the decision himself, rather than have it made for him. It was the Savoy brothers who handled it. Claude came to Clifford after breakfast and said, "We are leaving this afternoon. You can come or you can stay. We are leaving." That he said it without hostility, factually, the way a man states a natural condition. Clifford looked at him for a moment and then nodded and said, "We will pack in the morning and leave at first light tomorrow." He could not bring himself to say today. The morning was his compromise with his own dignity. That afternoon, while we were consolidating supplies and preparing the boats for loading, is when the creature entered the camp for the first time. It did not come in darkness. It did not come at night. It came in the middle of the afternoon at around 3 o'clock, when the overcast sky had gone from grey to a darker, more textured grey that made the light feel underwater, everything soft and a little unreal. Most of the men were busy with packing or were sitting near the fire. I was near the boats, coiling rope, and I was facing north, and so I was facing away from the southern tree line where it entered. I heard it first as a crashing, not the slow, deliberate movement of the night time, but something faster and more aggressive, the sound of something large moving through undergrowth without any effort to be quiet. And then I heard Séverin Doucet scream. Not yell, not shout. Scream, the sound of a 17-year-old boy, confronted with something that his mind could not accommodate, a high sound, quickly cut off as though he had covered his own mouth. I turned around. The first thing I registered was the food stores. The canvas we had laid over the central pile of supplies had been torn away. Not lifted, torn, and the supplies beneath it had been scattered. Sacks of flour had been punctured and spilled. A large side of salt-cured meat, and perhaps 15 pounds of it, was simply gone. 2 of the wooden crates we had brought for canned goods were overturned and their contents were spread across the cypress needle ground. A tin of coffee had been punctured by something that had left 5 parallel marks in the tin, like the impression of very large fingers pressing hard into metal. And on the canvas itself, on the white canvas that had covered the supplies, there were claw marks. Not the scrape of claws dragged across a surface. Punctures, deep punctures in the heavy canvas, 4 of them in a row, the spacing of them suggesting fingers that were longer than any human hand, pressed hard enough into the material to drive through it. The canvas was pinned to the ground by these marks as though it had been held down while the creature looked beneath it. Severin was standing near the fire ring, pointing south, unable to speak. His face was the color of ash. I looked south. At the tree line, where the levee gave way to the first stand of cypress, something was moving away from us, moving fast, but not in a panic, with a strange loping speed that was neither running nor walking, that covered ground with a rhythm that did not match anything I had ever seen in motion. It was dark brown or black, I cannot say with certainty, because the light was poor and because it was already entering the tree line. What I can say is that it was upright, it was moving on two legs, its shoulders were broad, its arms longer in proportion than a man's arms, its head carried low and forward on a neck that looked thick and powerful. It was large. Not impossibly large, not the size of a building, not the exaggerated scale of legend, but large. 7 feet, perhaps 7.5. The height you would imagine if you designed a man to be larger and heavier than nature usually permits. It moved into the cypress and was gone. The entire event, from the sound of it entering to the last glimpse of it disappearing, could not have lasted more than 15 seconds. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Clifford said, in a voice stripped of all its previous authority, "Get the boats loaded. Get the boats loaded right now." We moved. There is a kind of movement that is not quite running, a controlled, purposeful, rapid motion that keeps just barely ahead of panic, and we all engaged in it simultaneously, every man grabbing what was nearest to him and moving it toward the boats, not organizing, not making decisions about what was essential and what could be left, just moving things and moving ourselves. I remember carrying 2 rifles and someone else's bedroll and not remembering how I had acquired the bedroll. I remember Claude and Remy working in a practiced silence, the partnership of 2 brothers who have done difficult things together, loading the boats with an efficiency that made me grateful for their presence. Severin was in shock. He could walk and follow instructions, but he was not entirely present, his eyes fixed on something in the middle distance that was not actually there. I took him by the arm and walked him to the nearest boat and sat him down and put a rifle across his knees and told him to hold it. He held it. Gerald Trosclair was praying, not quietly, loudly in French, as the words of a prayer I recognized as one said for protection from evil, a prayer I had heard my grandmother say in her last years when the world frightened her. He was praying while simultaneously throwing his personal belongings into the boat, and the combination of the prayer and the throwing and the fear on his face was one of the most honest things I have ever seen a man do. We were not finished loading. Not even close. We had supplies enough for 10 days, and we had consolidated them but not loaded them, and in the end we left behind everything that was not already at the water's edge. 2 large packs of general supplies, most of the remaining food, the heavier camping equipment, Clifford's personal trunk, which I know was significant to him because he looked back at it once as we pushed off and then looked away, and did not look back again. We were in the water and moving north by 4 o'clock. The first hour on the water was silent except for the paddles and the current and Trosclair's prayer, which had subsided from its high vocal pitch to a constant low murmur that he maintained without apparent conscious awareness. The overcast sky was darkening toward evening, and I was watching it with the specific anxiety of someone who very much does not want to be in this water after dark. At about an hour into our retreat, Remy, who was in the bow of my boat and who had been watching the water and the banks with professional attention the whole time, raised his hand to stop paddling. We drifted. The other 2 boats coasted alongside us. Now, from the eastern bank of the channel we were traveling, perhaps 40 yards away in the cypress, came the sound. The low, resonant sound, the same one we had heard on the 3rd day, but different now, closer, full, without any of the distance that had cushioned it before. It lasted longer than before. 5 seconds, 6 seconds, 7. It was not a howl in the way that word is usually understood. It did not rise and fall in pitch with the wolf's characteristic melody. It was a sustained sound, a declaration, something between a moan and a roar that seemed to occupy the whole air around us, that seemed to come from the trees and the water and the darkening sky simultaneously rather than from any single direction. And then it stopped, and the swamp was quiet for 3 seconds. And then it was answered. From the west bank, and from the opposite shore of the channel we were navigating, perhaps 50 yards in the opposite direction, a second sound. Shorter, a different timbre, slightly higher in register, but unmistakably the same type of thing, the same shaped resonance. An answer. There were 2 of them. There had been the whole time, or this was a second one drawn in by the first, or this was something else entirely. I do not know. I know that we heard 2 separate sounds from 2 separate directions, and that the first sound, on the eastern bank, responded to the answer with a single, shorter call, and then there was silence from both sides, and we paddled without speaking through that silence as fast as 8 frightened men in 3 boats could paddle. We did not stop until we were an hour north of where I estimated the sounds had come from, and by then it was dark, fully dark, and we were navigating by the light of a single lantern that Remy held at the bow, trusting his memory of the water to keep us off the worst of the submerged obstacles. It was difficult going, and we struck several cypress knees and in one case nearly capsized, but we kept moving because stopping was not a proposition any of us could seriously entertain. At around 9 in the evening we came to a wider section of channel, almost a small lake, where the trees opened up enough to let the starlight through and where the flat open water told us we were in less enclosed territory. Clifford called a halt. We lashed the 3 boats together and sat in the dark and breathed, and nobody said anything for a while. Etienne, the quiet man from Crotts Springs, was the first to speak. He said, "What were those?" But it was not entirely a question. It was more the vocalization of a thought that everyone was having. Nobody answered him directly. Claude Savoy said, "We keep moving at first light. We do not go back for the supplies or the tent or anything else. We tell people we encountered a problem with the water and had to cut the trip short. That is all we tell people." He looked around at the group in the dark. Heads moved in agreement. Clifford said nothing. In the lantern's dim light, his face was the face of a man who has been rebuilt from the inside, the old confident architecture gone and something quieter and more accurate in its place. He was gripping the gunwale of the boat with both hands. He was not looking at any of us. He was looking back south into the dark from which we had come, and his expression was not precisely fear. It was something more like comprehension, a late and expensive education. Gerald Trosclair said, "Will it follow us?" Again, not entirely a question, a hope phrased as an inquiry. Remy said, "No." He said it with confidence. I think the confidence was mostly for Trosclair's benefit, but I also think it was correct. What we had encountered was not pursuing us. What we had encountered had communicated something to us in the only vocabulary available to it, and the communication was, "This is mine. You are not welcome here. You are going." Good. And the calling back and forth between the 2 of them had been something else, had been between them rather than directed at us. Had been, I thought, in the way that animals communicate after a territorial issue has been resolved, had been something like, "They are leaving." Yes, they are leaving. That we spent the night on those lashed boats in the middle of that small lake, taking turns sleeping while 2 men kept watch, and nothing came near us. In the morning, we navigated north and west without incident. By the afternoon of the following day, we reached the first navigable road, and by evening we were in a town with buildings and automobiles and people who had no idea that anything unusual had happened, and the ordinary world closed back around us with an almost physical sensation of relief. Of the 7 of us who had stayed, Clifford Arsenault, the Savoy brothers, Gerald Trosclair, Séverin Doucet, Etienne, and myself, 4 are now dead of age and circumstance, and the 3 who remain insofar as I know, have never spoken publicly about what happened. Clifford disbanded his hunting group that autumn and never organized another. I know from his wife, who told my mother some years later in the casual way that women share information in small communities, that he had nightmares for the rest of his life, but she said it without knowing what had caused them. Clifford never told her. He had that much discipline, or that much shame, or both. Gerald Trosclair returned to Opelousas and was, by all accounts I ever received, a changed man in specific ways. He stopped practicing law within 2 years of the expedition, which surprised everyone who knew him. He spent more time at church. He was notably quieter in social settings for the remainder of his life, and the people who had known him as a young man and met him again in later years often remarked on the change without being able to name its cause. He died in 1952 at the age of about 70, and I do not know whether he ever told anyone what he had seen. Séverin Doucet, I lost track of entirely. He was 17. I do not know what the expedition did to him or how he carried it. I hope gently. He was not a boy equipped for what he experienced. The authorities, as I have already said, were eventually made aware that a hunting party had been forced to abandon its camp in the Fond Noir. A deputy sheriff went out with 2 local guides in November and located the camp, or what remained of it, which was not much. The guides, I was told, refused to spend a night there, and the investigation was conducted in a single, long day. The report noted that the camp had been abandoned in apparent haste and that a quantity of supplies had been left behind, some of which had been disturbed by what the report characterized as wildlife activity. Like a later notation in the county record, which a man showed me once in the 1940s, added in different handwriting that the site had previously been the subject of similar reports, and that locals attributed the disturbances to what was described as regional folklore. The word Rougarou did not appear in the official record. It did appear in the margins of a photocopy of that record, written in pencil by whatever clerk had processed it, with a small question mark beside it. I have thought a great deal, over 60 years, about what I actually saw and heard and experienced during those 5 days in October of 1913. I'm not a man who believes easily in the supernatural, or who was ever inclined toward mysticism, and I was raised Catholic, but in the practical mode of people who use faith for comfort and community, rather than for explaining the unexplainable. I have worked hard all my life with my hands and my judgment, and I have not had much patience for uncertainty. And yet I have spent the better part of 6 decades being uncertain about what came to the edge of that camp and looked at us from the dark water. What I am certain of is this. There is something in the deep bayou of that part of Louisiana that is not catalogued or understood by the science of the last century. Something old, something territorial in a way that extends beyond simple animal instinct. Something that recognizes human intrusion as intrusion, rather than merely as the presence of prey or competition. Something that makes choices about whether to act, and that watches before it acts, that communicates in ways that are deliberate. Whether this is the Rougarou of the Creole tradition, whether it is some undiscovered creature that the tradition grew up around and was shaped by, whether it is something else entirely, I'm not able to say with any confidence. What Anselm told me, standing by the boats on the afternoon he chose to leave, has stayed with me more than any other single thing from that experience. He said, "The stories are not stories." I have turned those 5 words over in my mind more times than I can count. He was a man who had spent his life in that swamp. He had grown up with the tradition of the Rougarou the same way I had, with the same cultural inheritance. The same stories told to children to keep them out of the dark water. But his relationship to those stories was different from mine. Where I understood them as a useful mythology, as cultural technology, he understood them as memory, as accumulated witness testimony from people who had seen what I saw and who had found the only language available to them to describe it. The old people of those parishes, the Creole families who had been in that water country for generations, They knew something that the educated world of the early 20th century was entirely unprepared to credit. They knew that there were territories in the deep bayou that were already occupied, that the occupants were ancient and intelligent and dangerous, and that they had a very clear idea of where their boundaries were. And they had built a system of knowledge around this reality, on a set of stories and warnings and small ritual acknowledgments that served the very practical purpose of keeping their people out of those territories. It was not superstition, it was ecology. We came into those territories with our rifles and our whiskey and our absolute certainty that we were the most significant things in any landscape we chose to enter. We were not the most significant things in that landscape. We were, at best, guests who had not been invited and were tolerated for a time before being clearly and unmistakably asked to leave. And we were lucky, I think. I have considered this many times. We were lucky that what asked us to leave was content, ultimately, to ask, and that it communicated through tracks and sounds and the demonstration of its strength and intelligence rather than through the straightforward application of what was obviously considerable physical force. We were 7 men with firearms in a territory that something else had held for what I can only imagine was a very long time, and it chose to let us go. I've wondered what would have happened if Clifford had been more stubborn. I'm glad I do not know the answer. The bayou still holds those territories as far as I am aware. The Fonds Noirs is still deep and dark and largely inaccessible, though the oil industry has made incursions in the decades since my time that I suspect have not been entirely peaceful. And I read in a newspaper, perhaps 15 years ago, about a survey crew that had experienced some kind of disturbance in the deep swamp east of Morgan City, though the account was brief and the details vague and the explanation offered was a bear. It is always a bear when the official explanation is required. I know what bears sound like. I know what bears do and what they do not do. My father said, "The bayou does not belong to the living." He was more right than he knew, more right than he had perhaps intended to be. There are things in that dark water that were there before anyone now alive was born, before anyone now alive's grandfather was born, before the French came to that country, or the Spanish, or the people who were here before all of them. Things that have territories as surely as any nation has borders, and that enforce those borders as surely as any army, that have their own languages and their own purposes and their own extremely clear sense of who is and who is not welcome on their ground. We are visitors in very old country when we go into those places. The best thing we can do, the thing that the old Creole people understood and that educated men like Clifford Arsenault and Gerald Trosclair had to learn at considerable cost, is to travel with the awareness that we are not alone, that we are not at the top of every hierarchy in every landscape, and that there are things watching us from the deep trees that have been watching our kind come and go for longer than our kind has been keeping records. I am 81 years old, and I do not expect to see another spring. I've made my peace with most things, and I've made my peace with what I saw in that swamp in October of 1913, or as close to peace as a man can make with something that cannot be fully understood. What I have not made peace with, and do not expect to, is the memory of those eyes in the water. 2 amber points of light at 5.5 feet above the surface, reflecting the lantern, looking at us with something that I can only describe and have always described to myself in the privacy of my own mind as patience. It was not hungry for us. It was not afraid of us. It was simply waiting for us to understand what we were dealing with. And when we finally understood, it let us go. Not every story ends in blood. Some of them end in the only thing more humbling than violence, which is the plain and undeniable recognition that you have been somewhere you had no right to be, and that something older and more rooted than yourself has looked at you clearly and found you small and has chosen, this time, to let you leave. I have been grateful for 60 years that it made that choice. I am grateful still.